Before the Disney era, in a time when their future was uncertain, Marvel gambled and won. They took a minor character from the comics and built the world's most successful franchise. They made Iron Man. This is Marvel in Memoriam.
With great power comes great responsibility.
What more could I lose?
I am the X-Men.
Avengers!
I love you 3000.
Welcome back to Marvel in Memoriam, brought to you by the fandom Memorandum. Today we're deep diving on Iron Man and Iron Man 2. Now, to understand this movie, we need to go back to 2008. At this time, Marvel Studios had yet to release any of its own movies. It had licenses through other studios like Sony and Fox, but this is the first one of their own. This started the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We open in Afghanistan, where genius billionaire weapons manufacturer Tony Stark is demonstrating his Jericho missile to the US military. On the way back, his convoy is ambushed by terrorists known as the Ten Rings. They kidnap Tony Stark and hold him for ransom. Tony wakes up in a cave with a bunch of shrapnel in his chest. There, he meets a doctor named Jensen who saved his life. Dr. Jensen put an electromagnet in his chest attached to a car battery that prevents the shrapnel from getting into his heart. It's revealed that the true reason Tony Stark was kidnapped by the terrorists was so that he would build them the Jericho missile. With no other option, he and Jensen agree, but in secret, they begin constructing something else. Tony Stark secretly builds a miniaturized version of the thing that powers his facilities back home. It's a proprietary piece of technology known as the arc reactor. This will both keep him alive and power what will help him escape. Instead of building the Jericho missile, Tony builds a suit of armor powered by the arc reactor to help him escape the cave. During this attempt, Jensen is killed. Tony is eventually discovered and rescued by the US military and returned home to the United States. Upon his arrival, he meets Agent Phil Coulson of the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division. Quite a long name. He calls a press conference and announces that Stark Industries will no longer be creating weapons, much to the disdain of his partner, Obadiah Stane. Building upon his primitive cave design known as the Mark I, Tony constructs the Mark II battlesuit. And with the help of just a really very intelligent system, Tony's AI assistant, aka Jarvis, Tony constructs the Mark III battlesuit and dons the moniker the Iron Man. It's at this point in the film that Tony learns the kidnapping was orchestrated by his partner Obadiah Stane, who's trying to push him out of the company forever. Obadiah begins building his own battlesuit called the Ironmonger. The film culminates in a showdown between Stane and Stark through the streets and skies of Los Angeles. In the end, it's Pepper Potts, Tony's loving assistant, who overloads the full-size arc reactor, killing Obadiah Stane. In another press conference, Agent Phil Coulson of the Strategic Homeland Intervention and Enforcement Logistics Division, now known as S.H.I.E.L.D., instructs Tony Stark to use the cover story that Iron Man is one of Tony's bodyguards. Instead, in classic Tony Stark fashion, he reveals in front of the world that he is, in fact, Iron Man. After the credits roll, we get another scene where we meet Nick Fury, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Nick reveals that Tony Stark is part of a larger world, and he wants to talk about something known as the Avenger Initiative. Now, I know we've said this with Blade, Spider-Man, and X-Men, but you truly cannot get the MCU without this movie. This kicked it off. This was the very first entry. Now, director Jon Favreau, he had a lot of work ahead of him. Marvel Studios at the time, they did not own all the rights to their characters. The rights to the X-Men were owned by Fox, and the rights to Spider-Man were owned by Sony. So it wasn't like Jon had his pick of whatever he wanted to do. Now, he did have some characters that he could choose from, still a decent pool. And so it's interesting that they decided to pursue such a lesser known or maybe less relevant character. But even more surprising than that is the fact that it actually worked. I think something that really helped this movie is it came out after The Dark Knight, and so audiences had already seen a more tech-based human hero, and I think that that's great. At this time, Marvel was taking a huge risk. Jon Favreau wasn't the super well-known director, and RDJ, he was already known as very talented, but he was infamous for certain substance abuse and arrests and some insurance liabilities, and so he was often seen as maybe unhireable at the time. But Jon Favreau fought for him. He knew that he had it in him. He knew that RDJ would be the perfect Tony Stark, and that maybe the character and the actor could find some common ground in their acting. RDJ was already a fast-talking, charismatic guy, and at the time, he was somewhat self-destructive, although brilliant, just like Tony Stark. The Marvel executives were hesitant at first, but John pushed for it, and if you've seen RDJ's audition, you know the rest was history. Even RDJ has said that Tony Stark's life really mirrored his own, and I'm sure that really helps portray such a complicated character. During the production, Jon Favreau encouraged improv and natural dialogue, and so many of the great lines from these movies were partially improvised. This was able to create a more human, loose feel than maybe some other hero movies. There was also an emphasis on practical effects. Even with the Iron Man suits, those were practical as much as they could be. Now, maybe in some of the flight scenes, of course, there was some CGI, but there were real Iron Man suits, real sets, physical props, and I think that really helps bring a movie to life. The budget was approximately $140 million, and it had a worldwide box office of $585 million. That far exceeds expectations for a B-tier character. The critics loved the movie as much as the audiences did, and that's rare. And with the Nick Fury post-credit scene, audiences were starting to see that this could become a connected universe, which would change Hollywood and movie making as a whole forever. 2 years later, and after The Incredible Hulk, we get Iron Man 2. The movie opens with Tony Stark making an appearance at the Stark Expo. At this point, Tony has become a global celebrity, a government target, and a media obsession. The US government has been pressuring Tony to hand over the Iron Man armor, and Tony refuses, claiming, "I have successfully privatized world peace." But little do they know, Tony is actively dying. The arc reactor in his chest may be saving him from the shrapnel, but the palladium it's made out of is slowly killing him. Tony's aware of this, and so he begins acting recklessly and becomes even more self-destructive. We then meet Ivan Vanko, a Russian physicist who blames the Stark family for ruining his father's life. Ivan's father and Tony's father worked together back in the day on the full-size arc reactor. Ivan then builds his own arc reactor and these electric whips and becomes the villain known as Whiplash. During a Formula One race, where the Stark Industries car is being driven by Tony himself, Ivan attacks. Using a portable suitcase that houses the Mark V suit, Tony suits up and defeats him. The world then realizes that the Iron Man technology can be replicated. As Tony's reckless behavior worsens, his friend James Rhodes takes action. Wearing the Mark IV suit at a party at his house, Tony begins drunkenly shooting random objects like clay pigeons. James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, shows up and dons the Mark II suit. They then fight each other, and eventually, Rhodey leaves with the Mark II. Rhodey presents the Mark II suit to the US military, and they weaponize it with Justin Hammer technology. It becomes the War Machine. As far as Justin Hammer, well, we'll get into him in a little bit later. Nick Fury, realizing that Tony is dying, employs one of his agents to monitor his condition. Her name is Natasha Romanoff, also known as the Black Widow. Placed on house arrest by Agent Phil Coulson of S.H.I.E.L.D., Tony discovers a clue left behind by his father Howard. This clue helps him discover a new element that can replace the palladium core and save his life with a brand new, more powerful arc reactor. Now going back to Justin Hammer, Justin teams up with Ivan Vanko and provides him with all the funding he needs to try to make their own Iron Man technology. Vanko decides that the true weakness of the Iron Man technology is the human pilot, so instead he makes a bunch of hammer drones, though he does make one real suit for himself. In the end, Tony and Rhodey, aka Iron Man and War Machine, face off against Ivan Vanko, aka Whiplash. The film concludes with the defeat of Whiplash. Tony and Rhodey restore their friendship, and Justin Hammer is taken to prison. Now that Tony's health is stabilized, S.H.I.E.L.D. recognizes him as a part of a larger initiative. After the credits roll, we see Phil Coulson in New Mexico at what appears to be some sort of crater site. As we zoom in to the real content of the crater, we see Mjolnir, aka the Hammer of Thor. This sets up an even larger universe. Now, I think modern audiences really like this movie, and when I first saw it when it came out, I loved this movie. That being said, it does have a bit of a divided fan base. Now, after the success of Iron Man 1, this sequel was somewhat fast-tracked. This led to script pressure and constant rewrites during filming. But it also had bigger MCU ambitions. It introduced Black Widow, S.H.I.E.L.D., the Avengers Initiative world building, and teased for Thor. So that's a lot to balance. Now, Rhodey, James Rhodes, he was initially played by Terrence Howard in Iron Man 1, but he was replaced by Don Cheadle due to some negotiations and controversy about salary behind the scenes. This movie definitely leaned into comedy, fast dialogue, and Tony Stark's charisma even more than the first, and it explores celebrity culture and some government oversight. There's definitely a lot more larger scale effects and CGI in this movie, but it's really great. I think it holds up really well. The estimated budget is around $200 million, and the worldwide box office was $623 million. The critical reception was still positive, though it was generally weaker than the first movie, but the audience reception in the end was still strong. Now, this is definitely more of a transitional MCU film, but it's so necessary as it grows the world building of the Avengers universe. Now, of course, we need to get into our section. You know it, you love it. We must assume doom. But first, spoilers. Spoilers. We're going to talk about some spoilers. We good? Now, as you know, RDJ was announced to be playing Victor Von Doom, aka Doctor Doom, in the upcoming Avengers Doomsday. This had a lot of fans rattled for many reasons, one of which we're not going to talk about because we'll talk about that in later Avengers films. But really they were wondering, well, how can he be playing two completely different characters at the same time? Well, we haven't talked about this at length, and we are going to, but there is something that Marvel introduces called variants, and this is what happens when we get into the multiverse, where we have our timeline, our universe, we have all these parallel universes where different things have changed the outcome of people's lives and identities. And one of the working theories is that Tony Stark might actually be a Victor Von Doom variant, but we'll get into that later. Really, I want to talk about the similarities between the characters that already exist. Something that Tony Stark is notorious for is creating his own enemies. So as he grows, as his arc continues, and he does become a better man, he's still haunted by the demons of his past, both mentally and internally, but also actual people that he's made enemies of. In this case, Ivan Vanko. Now, I wouldn't say that Tony is the direct cause of the conflict between him and Vanko, but his father is. And there are some sketchy things that went down, but it also seems like Vanko's father wasn't a decent human being. And because of that, it led to some passed on conflict. So somewhat unavoidable on Tony Stark's part, but as we continue with other Iron Man and Avengers movies, you'll see what I mean by him creating his own demons. How does that apply to Doctor Doom? Well, if you take Tony Stark and you look at him through a villain lens, as someone who is intentionally doing these things, that's going to create a lot of enemies. And so it makes me wonder if any of our existing heroes in the universe will fit that role or fill that role for Doctor Doom in the future. Now, I'd like to talk about some more similarities and some more Doctor Doom theories, but I do want to save it for some future videos, and I don't want to get too spoilery, especially if this is your first time watching these movies or coming back and getting caught up in preparation for Avengers Doomsday. So stay tuned as we continue to dive into the Iron Man character and how it ties into Doom over the coming videos. In short, Iron Man is probably the most important movie for the MCU. If you don't have Iron Man, you don't even have the MCU. And that would completely alter my life and many millions of people's lives, potentially billions. So even more than Blade, even more than Spider-Man, even more than Wolverine and the X-Men, a big thank you has to go out to Iron Man. If you like what you saw here today, like and subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace!